It's a journey that helps you understand the business in a better way, and it's not just about the result.
What it can generate, but we have to express it in today's terms. So we say if the business can generate X amount for 10 years or into perpetuity, we say that there's a risk to that, right? It's not going to necessarily happen, so we have to discount that risk.
And that's how we try to address it even in practice. We try to come up with a range, a valuation range, taking into account the risks, how they might change, how they might impact value. If you're undervaluing a business as a buyer, the deal doesn't go through. If from the seller's perspective you're overvaluing it, again, it doesn't go through. So.
Welcome to today's episode, where we'll be discussing valuations in general and also in the context of mergers and acquisitions. Joining me today, we have Eric Mackay, who's a partner in our advisory practice, and Ian Abela, a senior manager also in our advisory deals practice. Basically, I'd like to start off this by maybe speaking to Eric a bit in terms of, a bit of an open question to start off, Eric. Why does one value? What's the relevance of a valuation in the context of a transaction? A bit broad, but we can get the conversation going like that. I think it's
exactly. It can set the scene for today's discussion effectively. I mean, valuations in the context of M&A are a key component of a transaction, right? The evaluation exercise tries to answer a very basic question: what is the value of this business, of this asset that I'm looking at, right? And it tries to set a bit of a basic understanding, a baseline between the buyer and the seller in terms of what value what is the value that you're looking at. Without having a proper valuation exercise and a robust framework on how we do evaluation, effectively you might end up doing an assessment of value and then of price based on perceptions and based on sentimental emotions, because obviously a seller would be building this business over a number of years, and obviously they would be attaching a premium or an emotional premium, if you want, to the thing. So that is one of the key reasons why it's important and why we do valuations and transactions. There are other aspects. When you do a valuation and when you go through a valuation process, even as a potential buyer, potential acquirer, there are a number of things that you need to consider. So you need to. The process itself forces you to understand the business, forces you to think about the growth potential of this business, the risks. So it helps you understand. It's a journey that helps you understand the business in a better way, and it's not just about the result. And then the valuation process also feeds into a number of things and gets input from different things, different processes. So when you're doing a financial due diligence, you're identifying issues, identifying matters that should be factored into the valuation process. When you're setting up a valuation, then the mechanism flows into the share purchase agreement. So the valuation concept is at the center of
it's like a bit of a hub bringing different parts.
Exactly.
Together.
So it's critical. Effectively, it can make or break a transaction. Can be definition between the success or a failing transaction.
A good starting point. So as in terms of kind of to get the conversation going, even in terms of where you're going. Just shifting a bit to Ian. I mean, Eric obviously opened this up a bit broadly, and spoke about the why. Let's kind of start to break it down a little bit in terms of how one would go about it, how one would start to prepare for evaluation, and potentially what tools and methodologies there are, approaches to actually do these valuations.
So, morning, Mark. Agreed. The how of the valuation, we like to say that there are three ways to look at how to get down to doing a valuation. Theory tells us that there are three approaches, and in a nutshell, The first approach is what we call the income approach. What we mean here is we look at the earnings that we expect the business that we're looking at to be able to generate. The other approach is what we call the market approach, which differs in the sense that we're looking at what businesses like the one we're looking at typically sell for. So we compare a similar set of similar businesses to the one we're looking at and say, okay, these type of businesses tend to sell at so many, 5 times, let's say, its earnings. And that will be our benchmark. And another methodology is called the net asset value approach, where here we look at sort of how the business reports its own assets and liabilities in its financial statements. And maybe this approach is for a business which maybe doesn't have a growth trajectory ahead of itself, or maybe a business which is in an industry where its balance sheet is more reflective of how it can be valued at that point in time. Typically, we tend to use the first one that we spoke about, the income approach. We tend to use it as a starting point. So we say, this business in front of us, how much does it generate in what we say free cash flows? What we mean is its earnings. How much does it generate in terms of not revenue and not net profit, but its earnings, what we call free cash flows.
So there's no one way. Listen, this is the only way as well. So
for sure,
probably an element of cross-checking comes in.
Exactly,
at points, right?
Exactly. So you cross-check. You do you come up with your projections. What we say that we discount those projections to today's value. So obviously, if we're saying that this business is going to generate money into perpetuity, we say forever.
Because the value of a business, the value today, is essentially what it can generate.
What it can generate, right? But we have to express it in today's terms. So we say if the business can generate X amount for 10 years or into perpetuity, we say that there's a risk to that, right? It's not going to necessarily happen. So we have to discount that risk and to give it to today's terms. And the more risky the business is, the higher the discount rate will be. But that's where
that goes into a bit more
coming on the technical side.
Yes. No, as in so that's a bit the how, and we said why, how, really and truly, but when is as in does one in the context of a transaction you have a buyer and a seller, and whoever wants to sell will perform valuation. But I think it's not just that scenario. This is a bit more broader. So like, when does one need to look at valuation, and what potentially maybe as well are the advantages of performing these valuations?
Yeah. So in the context of a merger and acquisition, a transaction, there are different points in time at which sort of you look into a valuation exercise. So if you put yourself in the shoes of a buyer, sort of if you're looking at potentially acquiring a target business, right? So the first thing that you'll do is you get the financial statements, publicly available information, and you say, okay, so you try to understand a bit what's going on, and then you say, based on what I have at this stage, what can be an indication of value? Because obviously you need to make sure that you're looking at something that is within your budget, right? This is like buying a house, right? So one of the first things that you do is look at the price, and you say, okay, is this within my budget? Is this what I'm looking for? So you come up with an indicative, we call it, first cut of a valuation. So that's the first sort of situation, the first instance where you look at a valuation in this cycle. After that, sort of you say, look, this makes sense for me. It's a business I'm interested in. It is within my budget, So then you start speaking to the seller. You go through an MOU, memorandum of understanding, and you start a financial due diligence, and along with other exercises, other work streams. And as part of that due diligence, you start identifying risks, opportunities, adjustments. And then you say, okay, so based on what I know, based on this process, based on this due diligence exercise, how can I further improve the valuation? Yeah. So that's another instance where sort of you revise your valuation exercise. Assuming then that you find, like with what you're looking at, you agree with the seller in terms of what is sort of the price and ultimately sort of what is the negotiated price. Because obviously a valuation gives you a value, and then you negotiate with the seller to ultimately agree on a purchase consideration, on a purchase price, which is then drafted in the share purchase agreement. At completion, then, based on the balance sheet you're taking over and sort of what happened in the meantime, you revisit the valuation mechanism to finalize the purchase consideration. So there are different instances, different points in time along the transaction process where you look at a valuation sort of always based on more information that comes to light. Yeah. So you start from an indicative valuation, and then you always sort of you're trying to improve, to refine the valuation based on discussions you're having with the seller, based on information you're reviewing. So
new information might come to light.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
So anything else that you know, any more information is going to have an impact on how you're viewing the value. I mean, you hear it a lot out there, as in there isn't just one value, right?
Of course.
As in the value can evolve depending on circumstances and information and changes that you're aware of.
Yeah.
Which is kind of going back to the first thing that you said, in terms of, you know, the fact that it brings a business kind of focus to see, you know, how you're going to value it, and you're getting information from all different aspects. And then if at a point there's something missing, but then it comes to light, it could impact your view, right?
Exactly.
Because views can shift.
Of course. So there is definitely a sort of a view of a buyer compared to the view of a seller, right? So it's like everything in life. If you're selling something, you always think the value is high. If you're buying, you always sort of try to factor in the risks and come up with a lower value potential.
Yeah, you're mentioning risks, because I was coming to that. Maybe you want to develop that a bit more, as in, because I see quite a few risks that there could be,
of course,
in terms of, you know, coming up with a value that makes sense. Maybe you want to kind of, you know, talk about more the typical risks that one can encounter or come across.
A valuation, although there is a framework, you know, although there's a bit of a science behind it, at the end of the day, sort of we say it's not just science, but it's also a bit of an art. Why? Because there are aspects of a valuation which are subjective. So there are certain assumptions which go into the valuation, which are subjective. So if you're looking at growth rates, if you're looking at risk, the discount rate, the multiple that you apply, as Ian was explaining, there's always an element of risk. Now, sort of you need to make sure that you're factoring that risk in the valuation, but you're also doing sufficient review, sufficient understanding to manage that risk. So there's definitely risk when it comes to the assumptions. So what you're putting in the valuation. There is risk then in terms of the achievability of the projections. So what we call the execution risk, the ability to execute the projections. Obviously, when looking ahead, it's very difficult to predict where this business is going. So you can try to understand and look at the market, factor in market conditions, market situations, dynamics. But the business might change, the market might change, and it's very difficult to capture those in evaluation. So that's it. That is another risk that we need to factor in on and be appreciative of, because it exists. We need to acknowledge it. And then there is bias. There's the bias from the, as we were saying, bias from the buyer's perspective and bias from the seller's perspective. Most of the time, you find that sellers attach an element of premium to the to the business because they would have spent their life building it up. From the perspective of the buyer, they always try to, you know, it's human nature. You try to factor in more risk. You're making an investment. You try to be prudent. So you might end up with a situation where it is a range. It is a range from what the buyer at the lower end and the seller is saying at the higher end. The reality most of the time is somewhere in between.
Yeah.
And that's how we try to address it even in practice. We try to come up with a range, a valuation range, taking into account the risks, how they might change, how they might impact value, and so therefore what is the valuation range. And we also take into account different scenarios. So from the perspective of the buyer, for example, if you buy the business as is, that is one scenario. But from a strategic perspective, from a business perspective, if you take over that company and you improve certain things in the business, where you think you can take the earnings, how can you improve the business, and therefore what would be the impact on valuation. So again, you end up with a bit of a valuation range, you know, from a base valuation to a strategic value for the business, you know. So definitely the key messages are, when doing evaluation, although it's a science, there's a lot of subjective assessment that goes into it, and there are ways how to mitigate it, and also expressing value within a range to sensitize the impact of risks on value, and also there's a range, between the buyer and the seller, and ultimately it depends. The price that you land on depends on the negotiation process between the two, and the strategic value that this potential acquisition can bring to the buyer as well.
A few points that probably I'll come back to, but I'll shift to Ian in the meantime, just to home in on an area that I'd like to cover as well. So Eric's mentioning these risks, and he touched on a few points. Essentially, when one's preparing a valuation, ultimately, although there could be a range, and one can argue for that kind of range depending on the parties, whether it's the buyer or the seller. Essentially, I would imagine that you'd start off by homing in on trying to get a base valuation and an effective valuation. In this context, and with all these risks and points that we've mentioned, what are the more practical tips that one keeps in mind, or you need to keep in mind, or you think one should keep in mind to actually achieve this, effective base valuation that you can stand, I guess, that can stand on its own?
So, linking to what Eric was saying, there is an element of seller maybe seeing a value one way and buyer seeing it another way. So let's start from the earnings side of the business. What we mentioned, projections. The seller might be seeing his projections in one way and come up with future cash flows, projection, and come up with a value on that basis. Now, a practical tip would be compare that value that seller has come up with, and see how it compares to your actual earnings of the business, for example, in the last year. Okay. And you say, okay, so my value came to X amount, my earnings last year were so much, the multiple is, the one on the other is 10 times, let's say. Is that reasonable? Is that typically observed in the market? Now here we go into another area of do we have these examples at hand of whether it is 10 times or 8 times or 12 times? In the local market, there is an element, maybe a lack of transparency, because there aren't so many transactions of this sort, and there isn't so many observations that one can compare with. But you can look to the rest of Europe. You can take the industry that you're dealing in, and you typically see how businesses abroad, which might be, either there might be similar transactions which aren't listed, or there might be companies which are listed, which have a price every day. And you can see how that price compares to those earnings, and if it's about the 10 times. So if the market price of a business in that industry abroad is 10 times to its earnings, then okay, maybe those projections were reasonable. If it's more like 6 times, then maybe it means that your projections are a bit aggressive.
You're mentioning projections, not to stop you. As in, how do you go about, testing these and assessing them? Do they vary? As in, I guess they vary between the type of business that you're looking at or the type of asset.
It's a good question, because ultimately, like how Eric was saying, a lot of it comes down to whether these projections are reasonable or not. So one way is looking at margin. So does the margin, let's say the gross profit margin, does that increase a lot throughout these projections, or is it in line with what we're achieving historically? If it's increasing a lot, is it justified? Are we bringing in new stuff to the business to justify that increase in margin, that improvement? Or maybe, there is,
I guess one can just say, okay, I'm selling my business, today I generate X amount, 2 million earnings, EBITDA, and in 5 years' time I'm going to double that. Yeah. But I guess you're going to test.
You would test for that by looking at how plausible those other new business streams to support the increase in revenue. Is it just a revenue thing, or is it a margin thing? Is it plausible that we're going to be more efficient in your projections? What is the reasoning for that? Are you, I don't know, are there maybe synergies which the seller is seeing and maybe they are unrealistic or not relevant? But ultimately, to bring down whatever value comes up to this sort of benchmark, and to see if it makes sense when you take a step back. Does it make sense? Is the value, Does it relate to its earnings?
So you're in the detail, but then at the end of the day, when you're coming out with your value or the range or whatnot, you step back, look a bit at what the outcome is in the context of both.
Exactly.
Previous transactions, probably, the market.
Exactly.
So to link what Eric gave the example of a property, someone can say this property is worth a lot because, in the future, but how does it compare to its properties like it at the moment in the market? That's like the market approach that we mentioned.
And that's why, again, sort of, even though we have like the discounted cash flows as the income approach as the main valuation approach most of the time. So we look at future cash flows, the projections, because there are a number of elements that are subjective, and up for discussion in a way between the buyer and the seller. That's why we then consider different approaches. So we have a valuation approach that gives you this result, another one giving you this, another one giving you this. So when you consider everything together, does it make sense? Sort of, do they support each other? And that is sort of how we apply the different approaches together as well. So it's not just one approach; it's different approaches. There might be sectors where one approach is a bit better than the other. But then ultimately, as you were saying, Mark, sort of it's always the reasonableness and sort of how you mitigate for risk and evaluation is always taking a step back and you say, okay, does this result make sense? Based on what I've seen in the market. I mean, even in local transaction, you sort of come across different transactions, different valuations, implied multiples. Does it make sense in the context of what I know in the market? That is, in a way, it's another risk and valuation. It is such a detailed exercise that you might end up getting lost in the detail. But at the end of the day, you need to be able to take a step back, look at the bigger picture, look at the market, look at the transaction, say, does this make sense?
No, interesting. Probably can keep going, but there are challenges that probably vary also between different sectors. You started to mention in the context of actually valuing it. So the approach to evaluation in one sector, one industry could probably vary quite a lot between different industries and specific sectors. I don't know, maybe perhaps Eric, you want to kind of go into a couple of examples or an example in terms of certain challenges, maybe, I don't know, in terms of technology or IP assets, what you would typically face in this area?
Yeah, I would say different sectors have different challenges. There are always challenges with valuations, but certain sectors sort of have certain issues which are, like you need to deal with them. Other sectors have different issues. So I don't know, if you take two broad examples, effectively, I don't know, sort of you focus on the one end, a more traditional business, I don't know, like importation and distribution business, right? What we call the FMCG, the fast-moving consumer goods. And so if you take that type of business at the one end, then you compare it to a technology business and a business which is based on intellectual property. So how do they compare? What are the typical challenges that you find in the two sectors? Starting off with the importation business, most of the businesses that you would be looking at would be mature businesses, stable businesses, generating a bit of sort of consistent profit most of the time, consistently over the past years. So we're starting from something which there's a solid base. When you look at their balance sheet, you have some fixed assets, you have some working capital, so the inventory and trade receivables, against the payables. So you're looking at something which is a bit more tangible. You can see the business. And you have a balance sheet on which you can look at. So there, typically we try to go down the route of having a bit of a practical approach to evaluation. What are you acquiring at the end of the day? Acquiring the fixed assets, you're acquiring the working capital, and you're acquiring a number of years of profits, And then it's a discussion around the multiples of the number of years of goodwill that you're paying for the business. So there, the risks from a valuation perspective, I know what is the level of inventory that I'm taking over? Is it a normalized level of inventory? If when you're looking at the profitability, is the margin representative of the future of the future going sort of margin in this sector, considering the market pressures in the economy? So there is a good sort of starting point, a good basis from a profitability and from a balance sheet perspective, and then there would be a number of questions surrounding key areas like revenue growth, gross profit, and what assets you're taking over. when you compare it to a bit of a more a newer type of business, right? So like
with more like growth.
Exactly.
potentially,
So
right?
businesses like in the technology space with more growth, with ideas most of the time, and when you look at their balance sheet, most of the time you don't find much in terms of tangible assets. Most of the value would be in the intangible asset, in the intellectual property that the founders would have developed. So it's a different type of valuation, right? Because you're looking at projections which show significant growth potential. But you're looking at a number of assumptions which might be a bit on potentially, so they can be optimistic, So if I manage to target this sector and if I manage to secure so many clients, this is the revenue that I'll be making, and this is how it will grow. So you're starting from a situation where potentially the business is a bit earlier, in like an early stage business with significant growth, and you're looking at the balance sheet, and there isn't much tangible assets. So again, different risks. Definitely in that situation, you have to factor in there is a higher execution risk, there is a higher risk that you won't be able to execute the business plan because you're starting from earlier on. There isn't a stabilized history of profitability. And again, at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, you cannot look at your balance sheet and liquidate assets on your balance sheet because it's all intangible. So there are different risks.
Exactly. So in terms of the biggest challenge there that you're mentioning is this growth, which we mentioned before. As in how do you get comfortable with that level of growth that's kind of supporting the numbers and the projections.
To link with what Eric was saying. So when it comes to the traditional, we call it the import-export or the FMCG or the more stabilized business, which has a balance sheet which reflects fixed assets and working capital, one can consider benchmarking as well the value that you can put with it, what we call net asset value. So how does it compare to net asset value? Is it 2 times, 3 times? It can be an interesting discussion, an interesting benchmark with similar companies. But when it comes to the high growth one, the one which balance sheet does not reflect it, it won't be a useful metric. That's something interesting. So the metrics can be useful, but it depends what business it is and what sector it is.
Exactly. So it depends on the sector.
It depends on the sector.
And how far ahead in its business cycle it is.
Yes.
So sector and business cycle.
Agreed.
Yeah. No, agreed. We mentioned a lot, and you touched on it before, Eric. But you can both have a go at it. So it must be quite a challenging scenario where you have buyers and sellers arguing for different values, and potentially, you're trying to figure out how this transaction can happen. They both have their different viewpoints. How, kind of these negotiation challenges, how do you go about them? As in, how does one kind of, you mentioned some of them, try to get the parties to reason out. I don't know, Ian, maybe you want to...
So the starting point will be, one could say, the projections. Are both buyer and seller comfortable with those projections? If there is a misalignment, even on that starting point, then we're going to have to say, okay, we might have to put some sensitivities on these projections or address it through a higher discount rate, for example. If the parties are aligned on the projections, then that's a better starting point, because at least there is alignment there, and it makes maybe the next steps less complicated. But if there isn't agreement upfront on the projections as well, then either you come to a more aligned point, or you address that through sensitivity analysis, different discount rates.
In terms of a transaction, usually, as we know, it's the fair values. Like we have a willing buyer and a willing seller. Would there be scenarios where you have a willing buyer and a willing seller? But the valuation remains a bit of a sore point.
Yes.
As in, but they want to transact.
Yeah.
This valuation, they don't find
it
that
happens.
sweet spot.
It happens. Obviously, the simplest scenario, the cleanest one, is when both parties agree. And we try to get there. That is what sort of the approach that we try to adopt. Like to try to get to a price where everyone is comfortable, and to do that, sort of you sit down with the buyer and seller sit down. Obviously, the buyer would be saying, look, these are the projections, as Ian is explaining, and you try to get the seller with you to make him understand the process you're adopting, the risks that you're seeing. And maybe you're overthinking about risk, and the seller might tell you, but this is not correct, maybe you should consider this. So you try to get that transparency and that communication between the buyer and the seller to end up with a value that ideally both agree. But in reality, in a number of situations, that is not the scenario that we deal with. So then it's about how do you balance,
bridge that gap that they might.
Exactly. So you somehow you still need to find a mechanism to make the transaction go through, but both parties in a way hedge their risk, right? So typically the way we do it is, and there are a number of mechanisms. So it could be that sort of the parties agree on a valuation based on the current profitability of the business. So we say, look, the business is generating 2 million of EBITDA, of earnings. On that basis, the value is X. And that's the base payment. So in that way, the buyer is getting into it, acquiring the business and comfortable that he's not overpaying, so they are paying on the basis of the current earnings. But then we have some mechanisms in place to protect the seller. Because obviously the seller might be saying, look, it's true I'm giving you this business, but there is a lot of growth potential. And I don't want to sort of just let it go,
And who would have invested in it before to bring it up to that.
Exactly. So then sort of the certain mechanisms that we use can be, for example, contingent consideration. So if there is this situation that happens, we get this additional contract, you get into this market, then there is a payment due by the buyer to the seller. If there is, this level of growth, you achieve this level of EBITDA or whatever, you get an earnout. The buyer pays the seller an earnout.
So basically, if that is not achieved,
then that doesn't happen. So like that, if the target EBITDA is reached, it's true that there's a payment due from the buyer to the seller, but in that case, the buyer would be happy to do so because the business, it would mean that he would have taken over a business which is growing.
Which would have achieved those
significant growth. Exactly. So, and the seller obviously from his end would be happy because he's still getting a return on the growth. So these are mechanisms, and there are a number of other mechanisms where you still make the transaction go through, but you hedge risk from both parties. And there are other situations. Other situations can be, for example, like when there's vendor financing. So part of the consideration is deferred and financed like a loan with the seller, which means that the seller is still bearing an element of risk in the business. So the buyer has comfort that this seller is still involved, and he, in a way, is making sure the business is a going concern. So there are a number of mechanisms to help us address these situations, and increasingly in a sort of transactions, even in the local market, we're seeing these mechanisms being applied even more.
Very, very interesting. We're coming towards the end of today's podcast. I don't know if you want to kind of just have, based on this conversation, something that comes to your mind as a key parting shot on your ends. I don't know, Ian, maybe you want to just something that comes to your mind, putting you on the spot a bit.
Thanks, Mark. To link sort of, okay, fine, we have these expectations of what's going to come in terms of earnings, but always link that to if there are either maybe similar transactions elsewhere, or what do the market multiples seem to indicate in terms of value, so that we can always sort of remain with sort of feet on the ground and tie in any expectations to
something tangible,
to the balance sheet, sometimes to market.
Okay. So the importance of this cross-checking, benchmarking, and this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm. What about you, Eric? Any key final point?
I mean, look, sort of as we discussed, valuations are such an important part of a deal, of a transaction, that you need to make sure that you're getting it right. Okay. If you're undervaluing a business as a buyer, the deal doesn't go through. If from the seller's perspective you're overvaluing it, again, it doesn't go through. So valuation is critical for the success or failure of a transaction. So the key message from my end effectively is when people are getting into considering transactions, the buyer and seller need to make sure they have robust valuation models in place that help them make an informed decision, right? Yeah. So if that you're considering the right things, that you're taking into account all the risks that you're identifying from a business, and that helps you make an informed decision.
Great. Thanks a lot, both of you.